I got to tell you guys about a few new products over at our favorite CBD store. That's, of course, PalomaVerdeCBD.com. The first thing I'm going to tell you about that's brand new over there is these Thcv Gummies. There's 10 milligrams of THCV per gummy and 10 gummies per jar. A lot of y'all are probably familiar with this THCV. Some people call it diet weed. It's very good for intermittent fasters. THCV helps suppress or dull your appetite, which, of course, a little bit unlike regular THC that, as you probably know, or at least you've heard, can give you the munchies. THCV helps promote energy, unlike regular THC, which, of course, makes you feel kind of mellow. This is legal, oh my God, legal under the Farm Bill. So thank you, Farm Bill. The second thing I want to tell you about that's new over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com is their full spectrum Nano CBD soft gels. These have the perfect amount of CBD with THC. 25 milligrams of CBD and 0.27 milligrams of THC per soft gel. Their everyday formula brings your body back to homeostasis and adds this nice extra layer of chill. I like that. I think you do too. A lot of us need that now and again, or maybe every day. Nanotechnology allows better absorption into your body, even better than their other products, which was already amazing. Again, this has a calming effect and it lasts about 6 to 8 hours. And of course, like the other stuff, it's legal under what? The Farm Bill. Thank you, Farm Bill. It's legal. I would not get you guys in trouble. Go over to PalomaVerdeCBD.com. They've got a lot of great products. I talk about them all the time. The massage oil. They've got the sleep bundle. They got nano CBD soft gels, CBD bath bombs, which are amazing. Gummies, tinctures, all of that stuff. Of course, for my French bulldogs, Lux and George, the pet tinctures and the pet gummies. All of these things are over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Oh yeah, did I tell you about the cool menthol sports cream? Of course I have before. It's the best sports cream in the world. I get reviews from customers on this all the time. That's the number one thing I like from this company. And they've got all of these great things. Over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com, you will get a promo code because Carlos and Vanessa, the owners, love this show and they want to help out the listeners of this show. Promo code BUCK at checkout gets you 20% off of your order over at PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Promo code BUCK at checkout gets you 20% off of your order. Go give them business and in turn, give me business. Now, let's get back to the show.
You are now listening to the Counterflow Podcast, a place for dissonant voices and unapproved opinions.
You get split in fucking half, but I call the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Here is your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Counterflow Podcast. Great to have you riding with us here. Another week. Yet here we are, another week as I record this exact moment. I'm on my second cup of Fox & Sons coffee, the best coffee. You'll hear an ad for them later on, so support them. This week, Tom Luongo is back on the show. I say back on the show. He was on several years ago. You old-time listeners, you old-school fans will remember the show was called Death to Tyrants before it was called Counterflow. And I had Tom on back then, way back then. It's been way too long. So I brought him back on today, and that's because I saw recently on Twitter, he had a thread. Now, if you guys aren't on Twitter, that probably sounds strange, but the threads on Twitter are essentially like an article. You can only tweet so many characters at a time. I don't even know what the count is, but it's not enough to write something that's long form. And so they'll do these threads on there that are essentially like, reading someone's blog or something like that. So he had this long thread. And the hypothesis, the working theory here in this thread was that obviously, if you're listening to this show, you are like me and we're against the Federal Reserve, right? And all that they do and all that, without them, a lot of the tyranny throughout the world would be impossible, especially here in this country. But what if the folks at the Federal Reserve are on our side when it comes to fighting or wanting to take down Klaus Schwab in the World Economic Forum and the Davos folks over there in Europe? Interesting theory. Well, Tom Luongo, as you're about to find out, does more than just throw a theory out there and see if it works. He's got a long, nuanced way to look at this, and he backs it up with quite a lot of proof. So again, he does admit it's a theory, and we might find out this is not the way things are in a year from now, or maybe less than that. But I thought it was very well laid out, an interesting topic, and something pertinent to a lot of the things we talk about here, geopolitics and one world government, who's on which side, who's on our side. It often seems like nobody is, but we're going to get into all of that. I'll tell you really quickly. Tom goes into kind of his bio here, but he is the head man in charge over at Gold, Goats, and Guns. His blog, his website, all of his information is over at tomluongo.me. He's back, but for the first time, it's on Counterflow. Tom Luongo, welcome back to the show, sir. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Buck? What's been going on?
Well, a lot. I've neglected having you on, and I apologize for that. It's been several years now. I looked back in our messages, and I thought, my goodness, it's been too long. So I've got a ton of new listeners since, I think that was like 2018. Before we get into the weeds of your excellent analysis of what's going on worldwide geopolitically right now, tell my audience what you do, talk about Gold, Goats, and Guns, anything you'd like.
Sure. So the website is tomluongo.me or goldgoatsandguns.com. It's a blog, a Patreon service, and a podcast, all on different platforms. It all runs through the blog. You can follow me on Twitter at TFL1728, where I routinely try to get myself thrown off that platform and fail miserably. But what we do is we marry the analysis of financial markets and geopolitics, so that because one is reflected in the other. And a long time ago, I came to the conclusion that you can't analyze markets based on the numbers. You can't analyze markets based on technical analysis alone or anything else. You have to incorporate a sincere political angle to your analysis, because we live in a highly politicized world. And when policymakers have the ability to change markets overnight, if you're not reading the tea leaves and you're not looking for those moments where the potential inflection points in history are going to occur, the capital markets usually tell you, beforehand. And this I learned from Mark Armstrong, and I think he's very right about that. So.
Well, a lot of times on this show, we'll talk about one world government, new world order, terms like this we're all familiar with. But I think, and I want to get your opinion on this, there's some competing push and pull going on with that. So in other words, it's not just one group that's ready to control. I mean, they might think that they're ready to control all, but I think even within powerful elite circles, there's some competing elements. And that kind of, what you touched upon that quite a bit in this analysis we're going to get to. But what are some of the competing power factions right now in this on the planet, basically? Sure.
This is the biggest, from the 40,000 foot level, we have four major blocks. We got the United States, with the UK kind of caught in the middle between the United States and Europe. Block number two, the Russians are their own kind of block. The Chinese are their own kind of block, but really the rest of the global South. And of course, then there's the offshoots of things like places like Brazil and Africa, South America. But the major blocks, as it breaks down, are really the four big countries or areas. From an economic perspective, are certainly the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, and the Europeans, with the Brits caught in the middle, and honestly, with the Indians still caught in the middle. But they've mostly shifted sides now. So it's can we start there, and then we have to start breaking down what I actually mean by that, because the problem is that when you start doing the analysis, it's easy to think in terms of country, because they're countries. But honestly, countries are the more you really dig into the analysis, countries are just kind of the marketing machine for a particular faction of global corporatist power, for lack of a better term. You can go into Alex Jones land or however you want to describe it. But thinking in terms of country, except at the actual policy level where it gets turned into law. And when there are elections, which will then potentially shift who's politically in control of that particular geographical area and that particular group of people, country doesn't really mean very much in geopolitics. It's really about faction, because that's what we're dealing with at this point. Now, in terms of the Russians and the Chinese, they're very nationalist. So they're easy to understand as a group of people whose policies and whose country are, for the most part, aligned, right? So the Russians are for Russia. The Chinese are for China. They have overlapping interests at a quote unquote global level, but that's not the issue. The problem is is where it gets messy is in the West, because the West is actually run by a bunch of transnational oligarchs and transnational globalists who don't believe that countries should exist. You look at the World Economic Forum, you look at, even the United Nations, you look at George Soros, you look at all these people, and they all say the same thing. We need to do away with political borders. So you should take them at their word, because they're erasing political borders left and right. And so the transference of political power out of state and local and national legislatures and into either supranational blocs like the European Union or Washington, D.C., which in itself is really the first big international bloc of the 50 sovereign states, because they really are 50 separate little countries here in the U.S. I mean, from a legal perspective, not from a de facto perspective,
Right.
because they've been run roughshod over by Washington in the same way that Brussels is trying to do the same thing now over Berlin and Milan and Paris and Budapest and Prague. So that's where you have to start thinking in terms of. And then once you do that, and you realize that there are multiple potential factions that are both ideologically possessed of a particular worldview and embedded like ticks across multiple governments, then it's a different thing. Then it's closer to the whole quantum / Spectre model from the recent James Bond movies. Like, we understand that stuff and we go, wow. Well, yeah, I got news for you. Those movies were a warning. They weren't fanciful. And they were kind of getting to the heart of what this is about. Certainly, Quantum of Solace did a wonderful job of talking about global warming as a dodge for international globalist corporatist control. Like, go back and watch the movie. Get over the bad editing and just go watch the movie and listen to the plot. And you're like, holy shit. So I actually really like that movie because of what it's actually saying. So that's the big thing that you have to wrap your head around. Once you start to wrap your head around that, once you start to see that and who represents what faction within each individual government and with each individual agency within each government, well, then the map becomes a lot easier to understand, because you see countries act against their own best interest, but you never see the factions act against the faction's best interests. That's the important point.
Are there competing factions? I mean, obviously, it appears that there is in the West versus, let's say, Russia for certain. But within the West, do you think there's competing factions over the EU and then versus
absolutely.
DC?
And DC.
Okay.
And 10 Downing Street and Whitehall. Absolutely.
Okay.
And it really does come down to, I think there's like 3 of them. And there's probably more, but I'm just going to go with 3.
Okay.
And I'm going to simplify these things, and everybody can read between the lines as to what I'm talking about. I'm not going to talk about everything that needs to be talked about, because we're not allowed to talk about things that need to be talked about.
Right.
So let's just all remember this when we're sitting down to discuss these factions and discuss this situation. Okay. I think there are 3 of them. And I think that you have the British, U.S., Israeli, Ukrainian, German neoconservatives, which are indistinguishable in many ways from neoliberals. Okay, they believe in the same thing. They just come at it with different rhetoric. Okay, and then you have and they're, in a weird way, they're kind of nationalist, right? But they're not. They're just they are, in that they believe that they're animated with an animus towards Russia and to a lesser extent the Chinese, which is deeply rooted. And it's deeply rooted in British foreign policy. It's deeply rooted in the European foreign policy, going back hundreds of years. Halford Mackinder and the Great Heartland Theory is morphed into the Wolfowitz Doctrine and the Brzezinski Doctrine here in the United States. And everything you ever hear out of the British Foreign Office and the British Home Office and 10 Downing Street is in service of this. The Brits have been at war with the Russians for 200 years. Putin made this very point in the speech, blessing the addition of the 4 Ukrainian oblasts into the Russian, admitting the 4 Ukrainian oblasts into the Russian Federation the other day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, his history lesson is, while a little skewed towards the pro-Russia version of irreality, had a lot of truth in it.
Mm-hmm.
And the Russians have had enough of our nonsense, and mostly they've had enough with the Brits' nonsense. But at the same time, you've got to realize that faction is also fighting with what I like to call the Davos crowd. And the Davos crowd is old European colonial money. It's not hard to figure out who these people are. Okay, it's old Dutch money and old German money and old British money and old Portuguese money and old Italian money and old this money and that money. These are the people that have run the world's behind the scenes through the banking sector since the advent of central banking in with the Bank of England in 1694, and even centuries before that. If you really want to get into the weeds of the limits of my knowledge of the historical context of like what was happening in Venice in the 16th century and all of this. But you can go back there if you want, and you probably will do a wonderful job of building off of what I'm talking about and come up with an even more explicitly accurate map. But it is those people. It's those banks. It's those 500-year-old banks in Italy. It's Unicredit and Intesa Sanpaolo. It's Santander, Deutsche Bank, and ING, and all of them, Credit Suisse, and all the rest of it, right? It's all of that old banking institutions. Centered on Zurich and Frankfurt, and Brussels and Amsterdam and London and Milan and Venice and whatnot. They don't bow to any country. They control governance. Okay. And everybody, we all grew up. I don't know how old you are. I'm 54 years old. But we all grew up until very recently. And we all grown old and got screwed by these people left, right, and center for most of our lives. And certainly the millennial generation behind us screwed even worse because they never even got a chance to build any capital before it was all taken away from their parents and now them. Multiple times, Y2K, the financial crisis, 2008, the Greek crisis, 2015, and now COVID, and now we're moving into now. They know they don't have a hope in hell of building any capital formation. And so they look at the easy answers given to them is that who's to blame for this? And the easy one is the banks. But we've all been inculcated because for years and for decades, honestly, they were all in cahoots together. Because they were all getting fat and happy and drunk and rich, incredibly rich, rolling up the profit from all of our work through their broken financial system and disgusting financial system into their pockets. And then they reach debt saturation. And now there's no ability to get blood from a stone, meaning us, because we've been blood white. The global debt situation is such that our grandchildren are already indebted up to their eyeballs to pay back today's liabilities. And the way they kept us all on the hook for years was by saying, well, no, the inflation is bad and this is bad and the taxes are bad, but it's all for your benefit. There's going to be a social safety net for you at the end of your life. There's going to be Medicare. There's going to be free health care, and there's going to be a nice pension that you'll be able to live on. But all you have to do is give us all the control. Well, guess what? That was a lie. That was the biggest fucking lie ever. And now those systems are broken, and they always knew that they were going to have to default on them. And so the process we're dealing with right now is how can they cover up the default of 2.5 or 3 generations worth of lies, political lies, and the stealing of all of our wealth. And by the way, have you noticed how they make us feel guilty for what we have left? They're going to roll all that up and they're going to default on every bit of it. And the price that we're going to have to pay for it is we have to accept global tyranny. We have to accept a central bank digital currency that can be programmed. We have to accept energy insecurity. We have to accept monetary insecurity. We have to accept all of this stuff first destroy what's left of our savings, destroy the middle class, roll all of the industries up into new nationalized state-run enterprises all across the West. Not dissimilar to what you see in Russia with Gazprom and Rosneft, or China with their banks and their state-run, their SOEs, what we in the financial community call SOEs, state-owned enterprises, which nominally look like private companies because you can buy shares in them, but they're owned by the local governments. Well, guess what? Uniper was just nationalized by Germany. It's the biggest energy company in Germany. Guess what? They're now owned by the German government. No different than when General Motors was basically sold to the federal government during the last financial crisis, and General Motors became government. Eventually, they sold it all back off, and for a profit. No, no, but whatever. So this is where we are. Like, this is the world that they want to build for us. They want no escape hatches through gold, which they're now going after for ESG purposes, or Bitcoin, which they went after for ESG purposes 2 years ago, or oil or anything else. And so now what they're doing is they're blowing up the entire infrastructure of the old world. They're blowing up our food security. They're blowing up our energy security. And they're goading the other factions into doing it for reasons that the other faction wants to do. Screw Russia, screw Germany, screw whomever. So you've got Davos setting up the Poles and the Brits with the U.S. help, with rogue factions within the U.S. who were all, British double agents and all the rest of it in the first place, because the Brits have been running American foreign policy for 150 years. And this is the situation. And it's not that hard to map. You just have to completely change the way you see the world. And once you see it that way, you can't unsee. So the factions in the U.S. are interesting because you have the White House, which is clearly run by the Davos, the old European monarch, destroying the United States as a cultural, political, economic, and industrial institution and legal institution, undermining the rule of law, trying to destroy the Supreme Court, destroy the tax base, blah, 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 blah. Clearly, they want to normalize us with what's happening in the EU USSR. Clearly. So they work for Davos. Then you have the neocons, which are running around like Rambo without a jockstrap, happy because you've got a senile guy as president. And they installed a whole bunch of the most hyper-aggressive ones on the National Security Council, setting our foreign policy, setting our diplomatic policy. Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Victoria Nuland, and the rest of them. The second-generation morons trained by Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, and Donald Rumsfeld, and others. So these guys here aren't even smart. They're the midwits. They're the second-generation midwits. Or worse, the third-generation old money. The grandchildren of the guys who made all of them. These kids aren't smart. They're inbred, stupid, and lazy. They just think because they have power, they can use it. So they're just being goaded to run around like crazy people. The Brits are feeling the existential threat of the last remnants of the British Empire and their ability to manipulate the Americans into doing things that aren't good for the Americans, while they try to chart an independent path and get the Americans to join with them to put Europe on the back foot. Because what we're seeing is a control over the West problem. And the third faction is the Federal Reserve and some of the New York banks that aren't aligned with any of this, who have been very vocal. Jamie Dimon over at JP Morgan, John Solomon over at Goldman Sachs, even to a lesser extent Citigroup, all saying the same thing. No one consulted us with putting ruinous sanctions on the Russians and blowing up oil supply chains and gas supply chains and in reinsurance markets and all this other stuff. No one consulted us with any of this. And so those are the three factions vying for control in the United States. And then they're interacting with all the other factions that are breaking apart that are now breaking up within Europe. But they're all, but all of them at a certain level have an animosity now, finally, to the old European money, because they're getting drained of all of their vitality by an overly hawkish Federal Reserve. It's the only thing that makes any sense. An overly hawkish Federal Reserve destroys the overseas dollar markets, nominally known as the euro dollar market. Okay. Like we have offshore and onshore yuan. Everybody understands that idea. Well, it's the same thing. You can call them onshore yuan and euro yuan. We just call them euro dollars, but it's offshore dollars. They're in banks in the Caymans and Europe and Hong Kong and Singapore and all this stuff. And they're stocked to the gills. And those dollars are sitting there in reserve accounts, and they can be levered up into handing out loans to people and creating more dollars than the Federal Reserve can create directly through monetary policy. They actually have more control over Fed monetary policy than the Fed ever did, as long as all the debt that all this was indexed against was the same indexing rate, which in this case used to be LIBOR. Now we don't have that. Now there's been a functional split between the American banking system and the European and the offshore banking system. And that wall, known as SOFR, or SOFR, is the thing that's actually giving the Fed the ability to raise interest rates far higher than anybody ever thought. And while they're going to continue to do so. And the reason is because the Fed was being targeted for destruction, along with all of the New York commercial banks. Because the whole purpose of what Davos is trying to pull off is the end of commercial banking. Because if you want the death of capitalism, what do you do in this scenario? Well, you blame capitalism for everything that's wrong with the world. Obviously. Who does that? Communists. How do they do that? They do that by saying communist doctrine to current events. Oh, let's give you now the bombing of the Nord Streams 1 and 2 pipelines, which is probably where you wanted to go with this. Think about this. Every left of center anti-American commentator fingered the U.S. and media. Pepe Escobar, Caitlin Johnstone, Bernard at Moon of Alabama, RT, most of Europe, the Poles. I got good friends in Garland Nixon, Jimmy Dore, all of them said the same thing. And every one of them said the same thing for the same reason. Ready? Because they firmly believe, as leftists, that the flaw of capitalism is competition and that capitalism can't sustain itself on its own. And so when a capitalist can't win, it's all Daniel Day-Lewis, I'll drink your milkshake bullshit. I'll steal it from you. I'll blow it up. I'll take it from you. Well, that's not capitalism at all. Capitalism doesn't use force. That's the definition of capital. Capitalism is the opposite of that. But they blame it using that Marxian view of the system. They firmly believe in the Michael Hudsons and the Richard Wolffs and all of them. They're all free commies.
Yeah.
Every goddamn one of them. It's their imprinting. I'm not even passing judgment on them at this point. It doesn't matter. They all have this. And many of these men I respect in other venues and other analysis. But on this particular point, they are absolutely 100% fucking wrong. And they're being led into the easy argument that capitalists did this. The capitalist United States did this because they want to sell gas to Europe and victimize the Germans. Meanwhile, the Germans are out there today. The big news that no one's talking about is that they're starving the Italians of energy by denying gas transit from Gazprom, the Italians want to buy the gas. Gazprom wants to pay the transit fees across Austria. And Austria is saying no because of EU sanctions. Who put those sanctions on? It wasn't the United States. Who put another package of sanctions on Russia, further restricting gas supplies and oil supplies into Europe? Who has told us that they don't want us on oil and gas anymore anyway? It doesn't matter if it's Russian or otherwise. Why would they do this? Why would the Germans do this if they're the victims of America? No, the pat answer is because they don't have enough gas coming through now. They want to steal that gas. Sure. That's the pat answer that comes from the people I'm criticizing. But the reality is that Germany's happy that Nord Stream 1 and 2 are gone. The political powers, and not the German people,
Right.
but the German establishment, the German political establishment want this. Because Germany is investing hundreds of billions of dollars into a new energy architecture. Because after terrorizing the German people for 50 years about the horrors of nuclear power, we need to get rid of the old nuclear power plants. What's all of a sudden happening? The old nuclear power plants are going to stay on. They're going to want to build new ones. And Germany wants to be the leader in the new hydrogen economy. Why? Because Europe doesn't produce any hydrocarbons. Old European money that feels entitled to run the world doesn't have any hydrocarbons in it. Well, they have some. There's plenty off the North Sea, but they don't want to get that money to the Brits. They're telling the Scots to keep that from being developed. This is why I don't believe in peak oil. I just don't. It's dumb. Oil, gas, it's all over the place. It's everywhere. The Arctic, the Antarctic, all of it. It's everywhere. I'm not saying we should be burning it for friggin' fuel for the rest of our life, for the next 200 years, but I'm sure there's at least 200 years worth of oil recoverable to burn for fuels that add a positive return on energy investment, period. I don't care. So, this whole thing, Buck, is insane because it's so clear that the Germans and the Europeans went into all of this with their eyes open. They weren't being led by their nose by the evil Americans into this. Are you kidding me? Please play the other leg, pull the other leg. It plays as a sucker boy every day, as I said in my article the other day. Which is a line I got from an old Gainesville shock doc. Used to say, pull my other leg. It plays Jingle Bells. It's hilarious. I don't see how people cannot see this because I can, because it's obvious that that's their imprinting. They can't see the bigger game. They can't see what this actually, whose agenda this actually advances, and who has to pull these things off at this moment in time, because the Fed has been aggressively draining the world of liquidity, rapidly forcing interest rates to rise, rapidly forcing mortgage rates to rise, rapidly blowing out credit spreads and forcing central banks to respond in ways that they don't want to. They don't want to stay at zero bound interest rates forever and make the Fed and blackmail the Fed to spend trillions of dollars that we don't have in order to make the United States, useless. So Pelosi and Schumer get us to spend $6.5 trillion on Build Back Better, while the EU spends $600 billion, keeping their people on a residual poison drip feed. Whose economy is going to be destroyed fast? Whose credibility in the markets can be destroyed faster? Whose currency is going to be destroyed faster? This is why they didn't want Powell reappointed at the Federal Reserve.
I'm so happy to have Fox & Sons Coffee as a sponsor of this show for a few reasons. One, Steven, the owner of this company, has been a proud supporter of the show for quite some time. So two, I get to help him sell his product. And then three, this is selfish, but I also get to drink it every morning, and I really, really like it. So I'm proud to sell this product. Here's his story, and these are his words. I don't even want to translate them through how I would say this because this is so wonderfully put. When I was growing up, I would often go to work with my dad on Saturdays. Those were special father and son days. We would go out for breakfast, and he would let me have a cup of coffee. These memories of sharing breakfast and a cup of coffee with my amazing father will always be my favorite memories of him. He has been the best influence in my life, and I am forever grateful for those days. I believe this is where my lifelong love for coffee began, and that's why I have created Fox & Sons Coffee LLC. Here are his goals, ladies and gentlemen. He wants to share his appreciation for absolutely awesome coffee, and he knows you'll agree once you try it. I should say, I know you will agree too, because it is awesome. He wants to honor his father and pass on a business and the spirit of entrepreneurship to his two sons. How about that? Please tell your friends and family about this coffee. It's Fox & Sons Coffee. The website is foxinsons.com. That's F-O-X, the letter N, S-O-N-S.com. Now check this out. You guys know I'm running for city council here in Lockhart, Texas. You also know the Mises Mayor's Pact is a PAC fund that is, helping me fund certain parts of this campaign. Can we say that? Is that legal? But you know what I'm talking about. I will tell you this. Steven, the owner of Fox & Sons, is such a proud supporter of this show, he's going to donate $1 per each order that he sells of Fox & Sons coffee to the Mises Mayor's PAC, who then in turn, well, helps me out in my run for city council in Lockhart, Texas. So you get delicious coffee, you're helping out a great supporter of this show, and then you're helping me run for city council. How fun is that? And I'm going to need more coffee, I have a feeling. So keep the Fox & Sons coffee coming. Once again, that's foxandsons.com. Let's get back to the show. There's almost a weird optimism in there somewhere. I mean, I've never thought, I'm not like I'm cheering on the Fed by any means, but it's almost hard to pick sides here, but it feels like going with the Fed people is a safer bet for us than the
It's actually the safer
crowd.
bet for humanity in the short. It's actually the safer bet for humanity in the short term. It's going to be hard for us. Look, in order for the Fed to break these people, they're going to have to take interest rates to a level that is uncomfortable for most of the world. It's going to look like the crash that Davos wanted to build back better from.
Mm-hmm.
But I want you to. I want people to understand, and that's why it's hard for all. This is why I've stopped talking to certain people who cannot see the nuance here. Okay, and and then if they I've been, and there's a reason for this because I'm going to most likely be right about this. If I'm wrong about the Fed, like this whole thing I've just laid out collapses, and we're screwed, and you might as well be buying a lot of ammunition. Because you're going to be having to fight people off at your front door for whatever food you've stored. Okay. But if I'm not wrong, and I hope I'm not, and I still hold out some hope that I'm wrong, because I have to hold out. I have to remain skeptical that everything I've identified here, all of the incentive structures, because the Fed has the incentive to bankrupt the ECB. Because the ECB is trying to bankrupt this. Even if, again, like I said, even if you just want to look at it through the lens of who's going to control policy for the West after this is all over, the United States or Europe, I think we know where all the European-based commentators come down on. The Pepe Escobars and those guys, where they come down on. They see Europe as better than the United States. The Yanks is rapacious and dirty. Okay, not Escobar, he's Brazilian, but you understand what I mean? Like there's an imprint here that's different. They're not American. So, in my mind, even if you come down on who's going to control this on the backside, I don't know. I'd rather the guys who are still nominally capitalists, who still believe in the pooling of savings in order to do big projects through the application of commercial banking risk assessment and a tearing down of the massive financialization structure that we have currently. That is it's not good for the banks. The banks hate this structure. They've been forced into this as much as anybody else. They don't make any money on net interest margin like it's, classic banking. They don't make any money on that. They have to go in and do book running for ridiculous IPOs at pets.com and WeWork and all this crap. They've got to get involved in really risky, leverage bets against, investment grade corporate paper and all these things that we talk about that, that they've been forced into these things by the ridiculous legislation, by this ridiculous situation. Now, some of it they've willingly taken on for themselves as a way to get advantage over their competitors. And some of it they never wanted. So I think that there's a natural simplification of our future coming back to much more manageable levels of leverage within the whole financial system that will take a lot of this out of the system. If the people who are driving the model towards centralization are beaten, and the ones who are just want to, and the cynical ones who just want, a 2% VIG for showing up, I'll take those guys every day of the week. At least I know who they are. Mm-hmm. At least I know that they don't really want to put me in a chamber or take me out behind the chemical shed and shoot me in the head. But it's clear that's what Christine Lagarde wants. It's clear that's what Klaus Schwab wants.
Mm-hmm.
Is it clear that that's what Jamie Dimon wants? Or does Jamie Dimon just want to continue running JP Morgan? And while you might hate the way he runs JP Morgan, and it may be wrong, it's not wrong like what these other people are talking about. These other people are talking about world war in a way that, and division between people and whatnot that lead to Auschwitz.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? I don't see Jamie Dimon wanting Auschwitz. Sorry, just don't buy it. I was chatting with a friend of mine yesterday, and he made the very good point that, Dimon had a real serious brush with death about 5 years ago. Remember when he had the aortic section?
Mm-mm.
He nearly died. If he had been anywhere else than where he was in the world, he probably would have. Now, a moment like that may change him.
Mm.
I was just thinking, that whole idea just blew my mind. But if you go back to when Dimon had the problems with his heart, that aortic section, which should have killed him. You might rethink what you think
Right.
about the way the Federal Reserve and the relationship of the New York Fed and the Fed are to the rest of these people. I don't know. I'm not, again, I'm not trying to paint anybody as a good guy.
Sure.
That's not what I'm doing.
Right.
I'm just but I am trying to paint them as human and not cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
Because they aren't cartoons. They are human. Like, best argument I heard about Klaus Schwab the other day that was really resonant was that Klaus Schwab's not a Nazi. Klaus Schwab is so fervently anti-Nazi that he believes that it was nationalism, and Soros thinks the same thing, that it was that during times of stress that people become nationalistic, and that's what actually destroys societies. So if we can destroy nationalism, we can destroy individual cultures, we'll actually build a better humanity. That's the most generous read of those two fucking assholes I've ever heard. And I have to honestly tell you, it rings true. And that's what actually makes them even more dangerous than you would have thought. Mm-hmm. Because now they actually think they're working for the betterment of humanity.
Right.
In a way that is solipsistic, all-consuming, and dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
That they would set up then. And they would look at the situation in Europe and realize that they're beginning to lose because they can't control the Fed. Mm-hmm. And their next move would be to flip the game board by getting the Brits and the Poles to blow up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, thereby ending energy infrastructure predictability and our comfort knowing that at least the pipelines are still there. At least we won't starve to death. At least we won't freeze to death. Now, what have you done? You've accelerated the agenda of the people who want to get us off of oil and gas by making it almost impossible for the oil and gas companies and their boards to justify investing in a new pipeline, investing in new exploration, investing in any of this stuff. You freeze capital. They don't know what to do now. Capital hates uncertainty. I mean, how do you put an interest rate on a bunch of SAS divers blowing up a pipeline? How do you insure for that? What's the interest rate you would charge for that risk as an investor? Whose ideology benefits from this? The United States? Oh, because they get to sell a couple of extra billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas to the Germans next year? Yeah, that's nice. Think bigger. Mm-hmm. Think like real players at the table and not the short-stacked idiots who are just happy to be there. Mm-hmm. Think of this as the final table, the World Series of Poker. And 8 guys at the table are all guys that you've heard of, all the legends are sitting there. And then there's 4 guys who made it through the ranks and we're just having a great week and they're just happy to be there. And they could even come in with a large stack. And then they get, whittled away by all the real pros. That's where that's what this analysis looks like for the people who are making the argument that the Americans did this from themselves of friggin' LNG. And listen to Anthony Blinken. He told you it's a good opportunity for us to sell more LNG. Maybe he's not the mastermind you thought he was. Maybe he's just a third-class functionary executing a script that he was given by people above him.
Would that be the
But they
neocon?
didn't tell him why.
Do you think that's the neocon
Because Anthony
faction?
Blinken is just smart enough to run the friggin' to run the factory, but not smart enough to have organized or built it.
Mm-hmm.
Midwits.
Mm-hmm. Do you think Putin is sharp enough to recognize some of this stuff, what you're saying?
Putin is more than sharp enough to recognize all this stuff. Putin's failing has been that he trusted the Germans because he has a soft spot for it. Putin's failing is that he sees Russia as an inherently Eurasian emphasis on the Europe power. And he always understood that if he could cleave Germany off, going right back to Halford McKinnon, that would stabilize Russia for the next 100 years. And of course, the Brits still believe in Mackinder. We still have the Americans believing in Mackinder. Brzezinski, Wolfowitz, same thing. The big heartland theory. If we can't control Central Asia, then no one can. And we would rather burn the world down than lose. Bring in, Leo Strauss and really Hegel. So to their thinking, and this is who they are, and this is what's taught as military doctrine at West Point. It's what's taught at every major political science department in places like Georgetown and VMI. I mean, all this is what's taught. This is the imprinting. They're not seeing anything differently than this. And so until that changes, policy is not going to change. Personnel is policy. So now the question is, personnel is policy. Who controls the Fed?
Yeah.
And as one of my patrons pointed out, and we talked about this on the last podcast I did with Alex Frander the other day, and I just published yesterday. One of my patrons did a genealogical analysis of Jerome Powell. And it turns out that Jerome Powell is an 8th generation American that goes right back to the Virginia aristocracy. That were the people who funded the American Revolution and organized the American Revolution. It's the Brits. So, do you think Powell is a race traitor? Or is he just the guy who was put in place because he's not that guy? He's not a little Devosian troll like Yellen or an ivory tower intellectual moron like Bernanke. Think about it. This is the interesting part about all this. Because if that analysis of Powell is correct, and I'm just throwing it out there. That analysis of Powell is correct, then he's just as ideologically possessed or ideologically driven as Klaus Schwab and George Soros to the ideals of what was supposed to be American. So it's really something to think about. And I hope I'm right about this. And I'll be honest with you. Danielle DiMartino Booth is a powerhouse. Is a woman who I know is still very close to the Federal Reserve. And I've been 2 months ahead of her for the last 18 months. And then she comes in and corroborates everything I say after I make the next intuitive leap. And she's been screaming in multiple podcasts in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the Fed is not going to pivot. And the people close to her, and the people who know her personally, who I also respect in this market, have been convinced by her. Now, I've never spoken to her, but they have. And they're starting to sound like me. food for thought.
Mm-hmm. Well, where do you think this is going to lead? And I mean, if they're not going to pivot, what's the next 6 months to a year? What's it going to look like, I suppose, financially here, but also rather geopolitically on a world stage?
This is where things get really hinky, right? Because if the Fed doesn't pivot, then the escalation has to continue. Just like the neocons continue to escalate against Russia, taking away all of Putin's non-military options. Davos is going to escalate the financial war against anybody who decides to try and ally themselves with the Fed. Look at the turmoil in the Bank of England and Liz Truss having to go back on this morning on the tax cuts because the IMF and the BIS told her no. And then someone ran the stops on the UK gilt market, nearly destroyed the free pension systems, and Truss's approval ratings are dropping like a rock. And someone, the full court press is on to lynch Liz Truss, and she's an idiot. She doesn't realize, has any idea what she's gotten herself into. Note this over the weekend that we spent 3 days wondering whether Credit Suisse was going to blow up this morning. That was a warning. We control your financial future. We know exactly where you're vulnerable, Credit Suisse. And if you don't bend the knee, we'll light off the depth charge and we'll take you out. Note the 3 countries I've mentioned in this podcast so far. Italy just elected a populist government, nominally and a Eurosceptic government.
Mm-hmm.
Britain already out through Brexit. And the Swiss, who have traditionally been neutral, but are slowly but surely betraying that neutrality from pressure coming from Brussels, under pressure coming from Brussels. Now, nobody else is under pressure. But the warning over Nord Stream 2, you don't think Hungary didn't hear that? You don't think the Serbs didn't hear that? Because they get their gas from Turkstream. And the pipelines are a major source of financial stability for defined benefit pension systems all over Europe. You take that away and you make those investments, you take the investments away or make them vulnerable. How all of a sudden everybody's having to do a new risk analysis on what the potential return on is. You don't think there's not the potential for cascading defaults, sovereign debt crisis, credit spread blowouts, and all the rest of it? Of course there are. Do I know what those things are? No. But you'll know them and you'll know it because they'll start the whisper campaign 2 days before they pull the plug, which is what they did with Credit Suisse over the weekend. You don't need to know what the thing is. You don't need to be autistic about this. I need to know all the information. No, you just need to know that they're whisper numbers. They're whispering that they want to take out Credit Suisse. That's it. And then they take some short bets, $10, $15 million they're willing to lose if they just print it out of thin air into the Credit Suisse CDS market and blow the spreads out. And all of a sudden everybody's talking about it. Like if I apply $15 million to an illiquid market, I can move the market. This is not hard.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't think that they don't have this up on the whiteboard, it's crazy. Of course they do. They have an entire Gantt chart for this shit. And so this is like, I don't know. To me, this is really quite obvious how this is playing out. But it's scary. Because the Fed was supposed to have an emergency meeting today. I don't know if we actually got anything from it. There was some confusion as to whether that was the case or not, right? And I'm just checking real quick to make sure that, just checking the headlines while we're sitting here, because we're doing this right midday when the Fed's supposed to make some kind of announcement. So I don't know, like are they going to pivot? We'll find out. If they pivot, am I going to be wrong? Then possibly, or someone got the Powell, or someone got the Diamond, or whatever. And, they got enough leverage on them that they can force them to pivot. But it's very clear that no one had any leverage on these guys for the last 18 months. It's very clear to me. But, whether or not that's going to hold up or not, it's a different story.
If they don't pivot, what's it going to look like here market-wise?
Well, I think the Fed has the tools and they've shored up the liquidity scenario locally that if things start to break here, they'll paper everything over.
Okay.
The standard zero hedge crowd will complain that the Fed's bailing everybody out. Meanwhile, the rest of the world is collapsing. And while, our markets are down 30 to 40%, everybody else's markets will be down 50 or 60%. The Fed will come in, save the day here domestically, bail everybody out. There's a number of subplots that are happening here that I think are very interesting, but I don't know if we have time for today. And I'm not sure that I have a fully formed theory on them. A lot of them center around BlackRock personally, but we'll figure that out for another day. What it will look like is we're getting an inkling of it now. The minute you take any amount of stress out of the dollar funding market, what have you seen? Look at the market. Look at the markets today. The Dow is up 750 points. Nasdaq is up the capital markets are up 2.5%. Gold is up. Bond yields are down strong, and gold is up $30, $40. It's up $35, up 2%. Silver's up, almost 10%, almost $21, and oil's up 4%. So when you look at it from that perspective, it's pretty clear that we were dealing with an extreme situation where where everybody was scrambling for dollars, so they didn't know if they were going to be able to get dollars on Friday. So the minute the Bank of England pivots and Liz Truss does what she's told, all of a sudden the pressure can be let off the markets. It just means that there's a lot of this. These people are still very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
But how powerful are they in the face of, a 6% Fed funds? Not 3% or 3.25%. But what if we're talking about 4.5% by the end of the year? There's only 2 Fed meetings left for the end of the year. And the Fed, as Ms. Booth likes to mention all the time, would rather not raise on the eve of an election because it looks too political. So what are you going to do? Raise 150 basis points in December to get the 4.5%? You can have an emergency meeting between now and then. Even if the Fed were at this emergency meeting, I said, again, I don't know whether this emergency meeting is real, not real, was just always the one on the schedule or whatever. But just imagine that the Fed, even if this is this today, we're doing this on October 3rd. Even if next week, the Fed says, emergency meeting, we have to have a talk. We have to have a talk. And everybody's hoping that the Fed pivots and blah, 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 blah. For a week, after the announcement, everybody's going to pivot, not going to pivot. There's going to be all this movement that'll be positive for Europe. It always works this way. If you go look at the credit spreads and the euro and everything else. And then the Fed doesn't pivot. What if the Fed just comes in with a simple reiteration of their hawkish stance and an emergency 25 basis point rate hike?
Mm-hmm.
What signal does that send less than a month out from the midterm elections? At that point, everybody loses their minds. What I've been saying for a while now, Buck, is the following. I was probably the first one to say the Fed is on a tightening cycle. Maybe not the first guy, but certainly the first guy publicly to say. I'm sure there were other people thinking about it. I was one. There were plenty of Austrian-style economists saying the Fed has to raise interest rates, but they can't, so they won't. The Peter Schiffs and the many others, even the good ones like Frank Shostak and others, right? And slowly but surely, what does that mean? It means that the Fed put underneath the market is dying. The idea that the Fed, that you can set a put under the because the Fed's always going to come in and you can sell a put and you'll make money on it. Because the Fed will come in and bail you out. So it's a put underneath the market. In options terminology, buying a put is bearish, selling a put is positive. In the same way that selling a call is bearish, buying a call is positive, is bullish. So the Fed put is dying. So how many people a year and a half ago, were bullish on the idea of the Fed put going away? Me. My patrons, all, at the time, all 800 of them, 900 of them, right? How many people? Not many. Now let's fast forward to the fall. The Fed is, let's fast forward to December, right on the eve of the first, when the Fed is we're going to raise interest rates in March. maybe 10% of the market believes. But the first interest rate hike, okay, now we moved that to 15%. Oh, wow, the Fed's actually serious. They're going to raise a quarter point. Okay. And we're not even into the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief yet.
Right.
Okay. Now we get to the first 75 basis point hike. Now what happens? All of a sudden, there's a lot of people who were in denial in February and March are moving into anger, depression, and acceptance. Where are we? Do you think we are today after 375 basis point hikes? I think about 25% of the market is accepting the fact that the Fed puts gone. Mm-hmm. Is that critical mass? I don't know. I don't think so. Or maybe 25% of professionals, commentators. Maybe. But a lot of them are in denial, and a lot of them are angry. Go read the Wall Street Journal. Jim Bianco had a great tweet today. It's like the wailing and gnashing of teeth coming out of the Wall Street Journal for the Fed to pivot it's off the charts. I'm like, yes, Jim. And this is why I love Jim Bianco. It's great because he gets it. So I don't know. I mean, it's pretty obvious to me that every day more and more people are waking up to the fact, because so many people believe that the Fed would never raise beyond a point. Mm-hmm. I'm like, oh no, dude, we're going to at least 3.5% this year. And the top of this rate hike cycle is going to be 6, if necessary 7. If, depending on the breaks. Mm-hmm. Because to break the ECB and to break the backs of these indiscriminate, disgusting freaking people who think they just want to farm us like tax cattle for the rest of our natural lives and control every aspect of our lives and feed us bugs and make us live in paper houses and all the rest of it in the middle of a financial hurricane. You can go fuck yourself. You raise interest rates. I'll be happy with Powell to raise interest rates to 20% for all I give a shit if it breaks these people. Because that's what needs to be done. Because otherwise, we're staring at the rest of the 21st century that looks like a cross between Terry Gilliam's Brazil and your average Philip K. Dick novel. Mm-hmm. We're already there in terms of the Philip K. Dick novel, in terms of the average ennui of your typical middle-aged male who sees no future for him. If you go back and read all those old Philip K. Dick novels, they're all the same. A middle-aged guy who was sold a life younger. In his younger life, has wound up in a terrible situation. Estranged from his wife, he's estranged from himself. He's got no future. Does this not sound like 90% of men today?
Right.
Because they haven't Dick was so far ahead of the future in terms of the psychology of the world that we were building. So go read Martian Time Slip again and not tell me that half of us don't feel like Jack Boland. It's crazy. Or Bernie or Barney Mayerson from he's a bad choice, but some of those, all of those guys, and those novels are scary. So some of them react and just become rapacious assholes like Barney Mayerson from Three Sick Battle, Paul Eldritch. Some of them become just selfish little pricks like Joe Chip and Ubik. But all of these books have the same thing. But Rick Deckard from Do Androids Dream Electric Sheep, Blade Runner, it's a classic example of the perfect early 21st century middle-aged man trying to deal with the aftermath of a dystopian 50 years worth of government control and false law and false premises and blatant lies. It's crazy.
Mm-hmm. Never thought I'd be cheering on for Fed rate hikes to stop.
Either.
Stop something like that.
I want to get back to hating on tyrants like Putin and hating on assholes like Jamie Dimon. This is what I want to get back to, but I may not be able to get that until I turn 60.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is analysis. I love your analysis, and I know my crowd's gonna like stuff that's been said. Can we plug away? Because if they don't listen and follow you already, they will want to after this. So plug anything you'd like.
Okay. So the big thing to understand is that what you see from me publicly is a version of reality, is only a tip of the iceberg. I have now moved a lot of what I do behind my paywall over Patreon and serve my patrons. And it's not just, it's only because it's just good for business. And, I do like eating, probably a little bit too much, but it is what it is. So but I do distill out and disseminate to the world, a lot of what goes through my head, but most of it goes to my patrons first. And we have a discussion about that first before this stuff goes out into the real world. Patrons are some of the most savvy people I've ever come across. They make me smarter every day. They make me better at this because they're engaged and they're inspired to find new information and have a platform with which to, help everybody make sense of all of this. So the Patreon is basically 2 tiers. You get everything except the newsletter, the monthly newsletter, which is a retail investor-based newsletter with a portfolio strategy and picks and all the standard stuff that you get from, my other gig over at Newsmax or Agora or any of those other newsletter companies, and all bespoke and original material, and about 12 pages of that, and then 10 to 12 pages of that every month. But then it's the meat of the service is the twice weekly market reports, which are private video podcasts where I do a marriage of technical analysis and the kind of rant you heard this morning based on the topics of the day, tying all that stuff together, where I go over the technical state of the markets like gold and Bitcoin and the Dow and 10-year yield and why the German US 10-year spread tightening means this, and I also do bespoke research for people. So if somebody wants me to do a cold chart read on a stock, I do that as well. And try and teach people how to read stock charts without bias, which is very difficult. And I think, I have not a unique way of doing technical analysis, but a minority view on how to do technical analysis. And then as well, I also do private blog posts, which eventually will get turned into, some of them will get turned into public blog posts and they'll show up, be reworked and fleshed out. But there's basically my notebook of what's going through my head at any moment in time. And I just put down in, I wouldn't say an unstructured way, but a relatively free-form way in order for me to get stuff out there, get the patrons thinking and talking, and also a way for me to codify and write down what's, this spam in my head. So I use these as like my version of journaling. Okay. Right? Like you're supposed to do, that your therapist tells you to journal whenever. Okay, fine, do that. My version of journaling is what I call the morning munchies, where I sit down and spam out some stuff about it. And I try and do that 2 to 3 times a week. And then one of them will usually be good enough to turn into a public blog post. And then, of course, we have the podcast where I try and bring people on that either just make me happy to talk to, because I need some bright spots in my life, besides my wife, my daughter, my goats, and my dog, or, someone I don't know anything. I want to learn from. So that's the thing. And the goal here, and certainly the article that went wide this weekend about the Nord Stream pipelines, was where I am in this after 5 years of doing it. Is this thing morphs into not just a wider audience, but now that the audience is here, what's the real thing? What's the real ethos of what it is that you do? And then what's as my friend would say, what's the telos, or how we're going to put that into the world, right? What is it? It's to improve the way we process information and reteach people how to think and assess information so that they can make better decisions and they can see things better. Because that's our goal. Our goal is not just to facilitate conversation. If we're thought leaders in this, it is to not only show people what's going on, but teach them the process of how you got to those conclusions in the first place, and to give them the same tool. So it's why I do technical analysis and what the psychology behind the technical analysis, and why I do those things this way. I don't want to give you a fish. Giving you a fish is easy. I got to teach you to fish. And I think that we live in an age today where we're so inundated with bad information that the ability to sift the signal from the noise is a Herculean effort. And I'm happy to do that. And then also share the process. And then share the wealth in terms of making it public and sharing the credit from those who, gave it to me. Because that's the way it's supposed to work. It is ultimately about building a better equipped community to deal with these overlaying psyops that are, tearing us apart and tearing the society apart. Mm-hmm. Because we have to stop that. this is the way to do it. So,
And that can all be found at tomluongo.me. Is that right? All of your
all
the links.
the link to the portal into Patreon. There's a link there. There's always a link at the bottom of a blog post.
Yep.
So you can find it. And if you're confused, and then all of my media appearances, including this one, I put up on as a public post on the Patreon feed as well for everybody so that, if you're not sure you can get enough of me, or if you're not convinced of what you got to need, just go to my Patreon at patreon.com/goldgoatsandguns. If you're not a subscriber, the only things that will be available are previous media appearances, which will help do all that, help, get you across the line as well.
Excellent.
Okay.
Tom Luongo.
Thank you,
thank you so much, man. This has been great. All right, I hope you guys learned a lot in that discussion with Mr. Tom Luongo. Interesting, like he said, we don't know that this is going to be the case, but he's certainly laid out a lot of facts and ways to back up this theory, so we shall see. I love having deep analytical thinkers like Tom on the show, and I think you'll love his work, so go support him and go check it out over at tomluongo.me. As for this show, most of you guys know this already, but you can find everything at counterflowpodcast.com. You can follow me on Twitter at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. What else? We got the Telegram group, all of those things. Oh, if you'd like to support this show, if you find value in this show and you'd like to give me even just $1 a month, or you can really give me hundreds of thousands a month. If I got Klaus Schwab, if you're out there, Soros, you out there, Koch brothers, I'll take your money. You guys can donate at patreon.com/counterflow. And everything I make goes right back into the excellent work and production on this show done by my guys Chris and Bobby and these guys that do all this hard work for me so that you guys can hear this show every week. Thank you once again. Until next week, you guys have a good one. See ya.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Counterflow podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.